In this episode here, we're going to be looking at literally elements of short stories, even as you're preparing to maybe a couple of few short stories before you sit for your end of course or end of year exams, especially for those who are sitting for the exams this year. But again, what are the elements of a short story? What does a short story entail? Now, here, okay, I'm going to just start into it in the media res. That is like, once upon a time, which is a phrase that beckons young and old alike because it lets readers or listeners know that a story is coming, whether it unfolds through the oral tradition on the screen of a television or in the pages of a book like this one. A story takes us out of our lives and helps us make sense of them at the same time. A story can be defined simply as telling of incidents or events. A useful definition for this book is that a story is a fictional narrative shorter than a novel. Whatever the definition, the story contains the following basic elements. These, you need to expect them in any short story, rather, the basic elements. Basic elements. One, plot. Plot. Simply put, the plot of a story is what happens in it. As one old saying has it, the writer gets the hero up a tree and then gets him back down again. Also known as narrative structure. A plot usually includes causality rather. One event causes another, which causes another, and so on until the story ends. There are a variety of ways that stories move from beginning to the end. The most common plot structure moves from exposition through rising action to a climax and then followed by a resolution. All right. In the exposition, what do you expect in the exposition? In the exposition, we are introduced to the main character or protagonist in his or her familiar setting, be that a neighborhood in New York City or a farm in the Salinas Valley of California. If the narrative continued describing this normal life, quote unquote, right there will be no story. A problem or a conflict is needed to move the story forward. The conflict may be external, perhaps between the protagonist and a family member, or between the protagonist and the nature. Or the problem may be internal, between the protagonist's sense of duty and her desire for freedom. For example, complex stories. That is an example right there. Complex stories often have both external and internal conflicts. As the conflict deepens, the story is propelled through the rising action to the climax or high point. Here, that bully of an ant is confronted, for example, the life-saving fire is started, or the inner demon is discovered. The tension of the climax is released in the resolution, or as in sometimes called the denouement. That's a French word that literally means untying. In the resolution, the knot of the conflict is untied and everyone that is still alive goes on to new normal existence. Of course, not all stories conform to the above plot structure. Some stories start at a high point in the action employing technique known as media res. Right there. Which means in the midst of things. Such stories will fill in the exposition along the way through dialogue or embedded stories. Another approach is to tell the ending first and fill in the rest through flashbacks. One effect of which is to make the reader pay close attention to motives and causes. Whatever the plot structure, you can be sure that there will be a problem and a character to confront it. Readers keep turning to the pages of stories mainly because they are interested in what happens to the characters. Called characterization, the development of believable characters is perhaps the most basic task of the author. But writers have many tools at their disposal. Besides the direct description of a character's traits, the author can also reveal character through actions, speeches, thoughts, feelings, and interaction with others. Depending on the type of a story being told and the stylistic edition the author is working in, characters may be fully drawn and realistic, or they may be representative character types. How important they are to the story determines whether they are main or primary characters, secondary characters, or minor characters. The more crucial the character is to the plot, the more he or she will be developed by the author. Even in stories that stress realism, some minor characters might only be present as types rather than as individuals. Another important part of characterization is the point of view, a perspective, right there. A point of view or the eyes through which the story is told. This is determined by the author's choice of narrator. There are three main narrative points of view: one, first person; third person limited; and third person omniscient. In the first person or I point of view, the I point of view, the narrator tells his or her own story, as for example Huck does in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The third person limited narrator is a character in the story who only sees, hears, and knows what the character could see, hear, and know. This means that he or she might only have partial knowledge and understanding of the events and other characters. Dr. Watson of the Sherlock Holmes tales is a good example of this type of a narrator. Often, this limited point of view is that of the major character or protagonist, but sometimes the author chooses to tell the story from the limited point of view of a secondary character. The third-person omniscient narrator sees all and can comment on any aspect of the story because he or she is an outsider, not a character in the story. Readers often like to equate the omniscient narrator with the author, but it is good to remember that any narrator or point of view is a carefully developed tool and not simply the author's voice. Some stories will switch back and forth between various point of views. Setting. A setting is where and when a story takes place. Setting is where and when a story takes place. It is important because the environment has a strong impact on what happens in a story. In this book, for example, some stories are set, the book, good learners, in which book you might be asking, which book? Of course, this is just the beginning of a book, another short story that I'm going to take you through, but it's good, it's wise again to look at the few elements of a short story, what makes up all the components of a short story. So therefore, in this book, for example, some stories are set in Harlem, New York, a ranching area of California, and a sleepy town in the deep south. These environments influence not only the actions but also the characters' attitudes. Setting can also help to shape how characters speak and behave. Sometimes the setting of a story assumes almost as much importance in the reader's imagination as memorable characters do. Theme. The theme is the underlying meaning or message of a story. A story may evoke more than one theme depending upon your interpretation of the narrative. For example, a story in which a character struggles with the decision to lead a conventional life or seek freedom and adventure could be interpreted in several ways. One person might summarize the theme of the story as rash behavior leads to ruin, whereas another might say it is better to have tried and failed than to have never tried at all. Whatever theme that you might produce for a story, it is important that you realize that the theme statement is not the story. Authors usually don't write stories with a theme in mind. They might get an idea from news items that gives them an idea for a character. Once the character is alive on the page, the character may take the story into places the author never dreamed of. And that is the point. After all, we read stories so that they will take us to places we have never been before. Have a good trip in this coming short story. That is after the first story that we've just done. And that was Who Moved My Cheese. If you haven't watched that one, you might as well want to pause right here, go back and watch on that one. It's again very inspiring and very eye-opening, even as humanity is struggling with life and trying to place themselves in a position whereby they feel better about their lives. Cheers for now.